Look, I need to be very direct with you right now. We are living through the most dangerous economic moment since the 1930s, and most people have absolutely no idea what is coming. The global debt burden has reached $336 trillion as of 2024, which represents over 330% of global GDP. Central banks have lost control of the monetary machine. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, they are all trapped in a corner they cannot escape from. Inflation is not transitory. It never was. Interest rates have risen from near zero to over 5% in the United States in just 2 years, the fastest tightening cycle in modern history, and this is crushing the real economy. Meanwhile, geopolitical tensions between the United States and China have escalated to levels we have not seen since the Cold War. We are witnessing the decline of one empire and the rise of another, and history tells us this transition is never peaceful. The internal conflict within the United States, the political polarization, the wealth gap, the social unrest, these are not random events. They are symptoms of a much larger cycle that most people do not understand. And if you do not understand the mechanics of this cycle, you will lose everything you have worked for. Now, let me tell you why you should listen to me. In 2008, when the global financial system collapsed and trillions of dollars in wealth evaporated overnight, I was not surprised. Bridgewater Associates, the firm I founded, did not just survive that crisis. We thrived. We made over 14% returns for our clients while the S&P 500 collapsed by 37%. How did we do that? Not because we were lucky, not because we had inside information. We did it because we understood the machine. I had spent decades studying economic history, studying debt cycles, studying how credit expansion and contraction works, and I had built a framework that allowed me to see the 2008 crisis coming years before it happened. I wrote about it, I warned people, most ignored me, but when it happened, it played out almost exactly as I predicted, because the economic machine operates on timeless principles. Debt creates spending, spending creates income, income supports more debt. This cycle works beautifully on the way up, but on the way down, it becomes a nightmare. And in 2008, we hit the down phase of a long-term debt cycle. The same thing is happening right now, but on a much larger scale, with much more debt, much more leverage, and much more geopolitical instability. If you want to understand these cycles to protect your wealth and profit from the coming crash or the next big win, you need to subscribe to Wealth Warp right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the information I'm about to share with you could be the difference between preserving your wealth and losing everything. This is not about fear-mongering. This is about understanding reality so you can make informed decisions. Let me walk you through exactly what is happening and why it matters to you. To understand where we are today, you need to understand the concept of the big cycle. Throughout history, empires rise and fall in a predictable pattern. This cycle typically lasts about 250 years, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, but the pattern is always the same. An empire rises because it establishes a new world order, usually after a major conflict. It gains reserve currency status. It becomes the center of global trade, innovation, and capital. It educates its people. It builds infrastructure. It invests in productivity. And for a while, everything works beautifully. The people work hard. The debt levels are manageable. Productivity grows. The empire becomes wealthy and powerful. But then something happens. Success breeds complacency. The people who built the empire are replaced by generations who did not have to struggle. The work ethic declines. The education system weakens. Internal conflict increases as different groups fight over the distribution of wealth and power. And most critically, the empire starts to borrow more and more money to maintain its standard of living without producing enough to justify that standard of living. This is where debt becomes a problem. Now, debt itself is not bad. Debt is actually a beautiful tool when used correctly. If I borrow money to invest in something that produces more income than the interest I pay on the debt, that is good debt. That debt increases my productivity and my wealth over time. But if I borrow money to consume, to buy things that do not produce income, then I am stealing from my future self. I get to enjoy the consumption today, but tomorrow I have to pay it back with interest, which means I will have less to spend in the future. This works fine for a while as long as my income keeps growing, but when my income stops growing or starts declining, I have a problem. I still have the debt, I still have the interest payments, but I do not have the income to service them. This is when the debt cycle turns. The United States right now is in the late stage of a long-term debt cycle. Let me give you the numbers because the numbers do not lie. The U.S. federal debt is now over $36 trillion as of early 2026. That is more than 120% of GDP. The interest payments on that debt are now over $1.2 trillion per year, which exceeds the entire defense budget. Think about that. The United States is now spending more money just paying interest on old debt than it spends on its military, which is supposed to be the foundation of its global power. This is unsustainable, and it gets worse. When you add in state and local government debt, corporate debt, and household debt, the total debt in the U.S. economy is over $95 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio for the entire economy is approaching 350%. This is higher than it was in 1929 before the Great Depression. This is higher than it was in 2008 before the financial crisis. We are in uncharted territory. Now, some people will say, well, debt does not matter as long as we can keep refinancing it, as long as interest rates stay low. And for a while, they were right. From 2008 to 2021, interest rates were at historic lows, near zero in many cases, sometimes even negative. Central banks printed trillions of dollars and bought government bonds to keep interest rates down. This allowed governments and corporations and households to borrow at incredibly cheap rates. The debt kept growing, but the interest payments stayed manageable because rates were so low. But that game is over. Inflation came back with a vengeance in 2021 and 2022, hitting levels not seen since the 1970s. The Federal Reserve had no choice but to raise interest rates aggressively to fight that inflation. And now the cost of servicing all that debt has exploded. Here is the trap. If the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates high to fight inflation, the debt burden becomes unbearable. The government has to spend more and more on interest payments, which means less money for everything else, which slows economic growth, which reduces tax revenue, which increases deficits, which requires more borrowing, which increases the debt, which increases the interest payments. You see the doom loop. But if the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates to make the debt more manageable, inflation comes roaring back because there is too much money chasing too few goods. The productive capacity of the economy has not kept pace with the monetary expansion. We have printed trillions of dollars, but we have not built enough factories, trained enough workers, or invested enough in productivity to justify that money supply, so we are stuck. Damned if we do, damned if we don't. This is exactly the same situation the United States faced in the 1940s after World War II, and the same situation many empires have faced near the end of their cycles. Now, let me explain the difference between the short-term debt cycle and the long-term debt cycle, because this is critical. The short-term debt cycle, also called the business cycle, lasts about 5 to 8 years. It is the normal expansion and contraction of economic activity. During the expansion phase, credit is easy, people borrow and spend, businesses invest and hire, asset prices go up, everyone feels wealthy. Then the central bank raises interest rates to prevent the economy from overheating, credit becomes more expensive, spending slows down, businesses cut back, unemployment rises, asset prices fall, we have a recession. Then the central bank lowers interest rates, credit becomes cheap again, and the cycle starts over. We have been through many of these short-term cycles. The 2001 recession, the 2008 recession, the 2020 COVID recession. Each time, the Federal Reserve cut rates, printed money, and restarted the cycle. But here is the thing. With each cycle, the level of debt gets a little bit higher. Each time we have a recession, the central bank cuts rates and makes borrowing easier to stimulate the economy. People borrow more. Companies borrow more. The government borrows more. And when the next expansion starts, we start from a higher debt level than before. This keeps happening cycle after cycle after cycle for decades. And eventually, you reach a point where the debt levels are so high that you cannot have another normal business cycle. You cannot cut interest rates anymore because they are already at zero. You cannot stimulate with more debt because everyone is already over-leveraged. This is the end of the long-term debt cycle, and that is where we are right now. The long-term debt cycle typically lasts about 50 to 75 years. The last major long-term debt cycle peak in the United States was in the 1930s. Think about what happened then. The roaring 20s, massive credit expansion, stock market boom, everyone getting rich, debt levels soaring, and then 1929, the crash, the Great Depression, unemployment at 25%, banks failing, businesses collapsing, deflation. It was a disaster. And the reason it was so bad was because we had reached the end of a long-term debt cycle. There was too much debt in the system. The normal tools, cutting interest rates, did not work because rates were already low and nobody wanted to borrow more because they were already drowning in debt. So what happened? The government had to step in and restructure the debt. The U.S. went off the gold standard in 1933. The dollar was devalued, debts were written down, and eventually World War II came along, which forced massive fiscal stimulus and restructured the entire global order. We are now in a similar position. The debt levels are too high. Interest rates have been at zero or near zero for over a decade after 2008. Central banks have printed over $25 trillion globally since 2008 through quantitative easing. And it has not been enough. The economy is still fragile. Growth is weak. Productivity growth has been anemic, averaging less than 1.5% per year in most developed economies over the past decade, compared to 2 to 3% in previous decades. The wealth gap is enormous. The top 1% in the United States now own over 32% of all wealth, while the bottom 50% own less than 2%. This level of inequality is higher than it was in the 1920s before the Great Depression. And when you have this level of inequality combined with this level of debt, you create enormous internal conflict. Internal conflict is one of the key indicators of where we are in the big cycle. When an empire is rising, people generally work together. There is a shared sense of purpose. The wealth is being created and distributed broadly enough that most people feel like they are benefiting. But when an empire is in decline, internal conflict rises. Different groups fight over the shrinking pie. Political polarization increases. People lose faith in institutions. Trust breaks down. And you start to see extreme political movements on both the left and the right. People start questioning the system itself. Does this sound familiar? Look at the United States today. The political polarization is extreme. Trust in government is at historic lows, with recent polls showing only about 20% of Americans trust the government to do the right thing most of the time, down from over 70% in the 1960s. Trust in media is collapsing. Trust in institutions across the board is declining. We have had violent protests. We have had a contested election. We have serious discussions about whether democracy itself will survive. This is not normal. This is a sign that we are late in the cycle. And it is not just the United States. Look at Europe. Political fragmentation, the rise of populist movements on both the left and right, Brexit, the European Union struggling to hold together, economic stagnation, youth unemployment in countries like Spain and Italy above 20%, the migration crisis creating social tension. Look at China. They have their own massive debt problem. Total debt in China is estimated at over 300% of GDP. The property sector, which accounts for about 30% of their economy, is in crisis. Major developers like Evergrande and Country Garden have defaulted on hundreds of billions of dollars in debt. Local government financing vehicles are underwater. Chinese banks are sitting on trillions in bad loans, and the Chinese government is caught in the same trap as everyone else. If they try to deleverage and clean up the debt, the economy crashes. If they keep stimulating, the debt problem gets worse. So you have two major powers, the United States and China, both with unsustainable debt levels, both losing productivity momentum, both facing internal political challenges, and both competing for global dominance. This is an incredibly dangerous situation. History shows us that when you have a rising power challenging an established power, the probability of conflict is very high. Scholars call this the Thucydides trap, named after the ancient Greek historian who observed that when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, war is almost inevitable. In the past 500 years, there have been 16 cases of a rising power challenging a ruling power. In 12 of those cases, it led to war. We are in one of those moments right now. The competition between the U.S. and China is playing out on multiple levels: economic, technological, military, ideological. The U.S. has imposed tariffs and export controls on Chinese technology, particularly semiconductors and advanced AI chips. China has responded with its own restrictions and is working furiously to achieve technological independence. The U.S. is building alliances to contain China, the Quad with India, Japan, and Australia, AUKUS with the UK and Australia, strengthening ties with the Philippines and other Southeast Asian nations. China is expanding its influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, which has invested over $1 trillion in infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Europe. China is building military bases. The South China Sea is a flashpoint. Taiwan is a flashpoint. Any miscalculation could lead to a military confrontation that would make the Ukraine-Russia conflict look small by comparison. And that brings me to the third key factor in the big cycle: external conflict. When you have internal disorder and economic stress, external conflict often follows. Leaders use external enemies to unify their population and distract from internal problems. We saw this in the 1930s. The Great Depression led to internal chaos in many countries, which led to the rise of extreme leaders, which led to World War II. I am not saying we are inevitably headed for World War III, but I am saying the risk is higher than it has been in decades. The war in Ukraine is the most significant land war in Europe since World War II. It has disrupted energy markets, food markets, and supply chains globally. It has accelerated the fragmentation of the global order into competing blocs. The conflict in the Middle East continues to simmer with potential for escalation. Iran's nuclear program, the tensions between Israel and its neighbors, the competition for influence between the U.S. and China in the region. Any of these could explode into a wider conflict. Now, when you combine all these factors, massive debt, declining productivity, internal disorder, external conflict, and the rise and fall of empires, you get a period of enormous instability and change. This is what I call a paradigm shift. The old order is breaking down. The rules that governed the world for the past 75 years since World War II are no longer working. We are transitioning to a new order, and we do not yet know what that new order will look like. These transition periods are always chaotic and dangerous, but they also create enormous opportunities for those who understand what is happening. Let me get specific about what this means for you and your money. The old playbook does not work anymore. For the past 40 years, from 1980 to 2020, the playbook was simple. Buy stocks and bonds. Interest rates were falling the entire time, which meant bond prices were going up. Debt was growing, which meant corporate profits were growing, which meant stock prices were going up. It was a beautiful bull market that lasted 4 decades with only brief interruptions. The traditional 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks and 40% bonds, delivered consistent returns with relatively low volatility. But that game is over. Interest rates bottomed out. They went to zero, and in some countries even went negative. They cannot go much lower. In fact, they have been rising since 2022, and they will likely stay elevated or continue rising because of inflation pressures, debt monetization, and the breakdown of global trade. When interest rates rise, bond prices fall. So the bond part of your portfolio is no longer a safe haven. It is a risk. And stocks are overvalued by almost any historical measure. The price-to-earnings ratio of the S&P 500 has been above 20 for most of the past few years, compared to the historical average of around 15. The Buffett indicator, which is total stock market capitalization divided by GDP, is above 175%, compared to a historical average of around 80 to 100%. The only time it was higher was during the dot-com bubble in 2000, and we know how that ended. So if bonds are risky and stocks are overvalued, where do you put your money? This is the critical question, and the answer is you need to diversify differently than you did in the past. You need to think about real assets. Gold. Gold has been money for 5,000 years. It is the ultimate store of value in times of currency debasement and political instability. Central banks around the world have been buying gold at record levels. In 2022 and 2023 and 2024, central banks bought over 1,000 tons of gold per year, the highest levels in decades. Why? Because they understand that the dollar-based system is under stress. They understand that the U.S. cannot keep printing money forever without consequences. They are diversifying away from dollar reserves into gold, and the price of gold has responded, reaching over $2,700 per ounce in late 2024 and continuing to climb in 2025 and early 2026, up from around $1,800 just a few years ago. You need to think about inflation-protected assets, real estate, but be careful. Not all real estate is the same. In an inflationary environment with rising interest rates, highly leveraged real estate can be a disaster because the debt service costs explode. But well-located, cash-flowing real estate with low leverage can be a good hedge against inflation. Commodities, energy, agricultural products, industrial metals. These tend to do well in inflationary environments because they are real things that people need. When paper money is losing value, real things hold value. You need to think about different geographies. Do not put all your eggs in one country's basket. If the U.S. declines, other parts of the world may rise. If the dollar loses reserve currency status, other currencies may strengthen. You need geographic diversification, and you need to think about different types of financial assets, not just stocks and bonds, but also alternative investments, private equity, venture capital, hedge funds, strategies that can make money in both up and down markets. But more important than any specific investment advice is the framework. You need to understand the machine. You need to understand where we are in the cycle. You need to understand that we are not in a normal environment. We are in a deleveraging. A deleveraging is a period where the debt burden is too high and has to come down. There are 4 ways to reduce debt. 1, austerity. You cut spending, tighten your belt, pay down the debt slowly over time. This is painful. It causes recessions or depressions. It is politically very difficult. 2. Debt defaults and restructurings. Borrowers simply do not pay back what they owe. This wipes out creditors. It causes financial crises. It is traumatic, but it can work. 3. Wealth redistribution. You tax the rich and transfer money to the poor or to the government to pay down debt. This is politically contentious and can cause capital flight. 4. Money printing and inflation. The central bank prints money, and the government uses that money to pay its debts or to stimulate the economy. This devalues the currency and creates inflation, but it is the easiest politically because it is a hidden tax that most people do not understand. History shows us that all four methods are usually used to some degree during a deleveraging. We are seeing all of them today. There has been some austerity in Europe after the debt crisis. There have been debt defaults. Look at all the corporate bankruptcies and the problems in emerging markets. There is increasing talk of wealth redistribution, higher taxes on the rich, wealth taxes. And there has been massive money printing, over $25 trillion of quantitative easing globally since 2008, plus the trillions in fiscal stimulus during COVID. The question is, what is the mix going to be, and how does it play out? My view, based on history and the current political dynamics, is that we will see mostly money printing and inflation. Why? Because it is the path of least resistance politically. Politicians do not want to cut spending because that angers voters. They do not want to default on debt because that causes a financial crisis. They do not want to raise taxes too much because that angers the wealthy and causes capital to flee. So they will print money, they will call it stimulus or quantitative easing or modern monetary theory or whatever term makes it sound acceptable. But the reality is they are creating money out of thin air to pay for government spending and to keep the debt machine running a little longer. And what does that mean? It means inflation, not the 2% inflation the central banks target. We are talking about sustained inflation of 4, 5, 6% or higher over the next decade. Maybe not every single year. There will be ups and downs, but the trend will be toward higher inflation. Why? Because the productive capacity of the economy is not growing fast enough to absorb all the money being created. Productivity growth has been weak. Labor force growth in developed countries is slowing or even negative due to aging populations. Investment in infrastructure and education has been insufficient. Technology is helping, but not enough to offset the other factors.